He had millions in the bank, but no one to share Christmas with, until a 5-year-old in a red coat asked, "Are you alone?" What happened next changed his life forever. Snow blanketed the streets like a soft hush had fallen across the world, and in the middle of it all sat Edward Munro on a park bench that was half covered in frost, his long black coat dusted with flakes, his leather gloves motionless in his lap and his eyes fixed ahead without really seeing anything. He was handsome in a way that belonged on the cover of a magazine, tall, sharply dressed, with short brown hair that curled slightly near the temples and eyes that might have once been warm but now only held the dull gleam of fatigue. He looked like a man who had it all, and yet in the way his shoulders slouched and the stillness of his face it was clear something was missing around him. The town buzzed with the quiet excitement of Christmas Eve. Families rushed past him carrying wrapped boxes and giggling children. Couples huddled close, their breath visible in the cold, their eyes lit with joy. Nearby a group of children were sledding down a small hill, squealing and laughing in high-pitched delight. He could hear music too faint, like it was coming from a radio behind a closed window or maybe from inside one of the shops, and even though the world around him sparkled with life, Edward felt like he was watching it all from behind a pane of glass. His thoughts were a blur of motionless noise, memories, names, headlines, meetings, stock prices, and all of it meant nothing right now. None of it filled the quiet he carried inside him. He had not intended to be here in this little town with its quaint storefronts and string lights draped over telephone poles. His flight home had been cancelled due to a snowstorm, and instead of waiting in the private airport lounge he had walked for hours, not sure where he was going, until his feet brought him to this bench, as if his body knew he needed to stop before his mind caught up. His phone was in his pocket, silent. He had turned it off without a second thought, and there was no one expecting a message, no one waiting in some high-rise condo, no family to call, no partner to check in with. For the first time in a long time he was not busy, and the stillness made him feel strangely exposed. A gust of wind blew through the park and he shivered slightly, pulling his coat tighter, but he did not move. He just stared blankly ahead until a voice broke through the white noise, soft and high and close. "Are you alone?" He blinked and turned his head slowly. Standing just a few steps away was a little girl no older than 5, wearing a bright red coat and a matching knit hat with a pom-pom on top. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold and strands of brown hair poked out from under her hat curling against her face. Her eyes were big and brown and filled with something simple and honest. She asked again, "Are you alone?" "Yes," he replied after a pause, unsure what else to say. She studied him for a moment like she was evaluating something deep inside him. Then she nodded and said, "You can come to our house if you want. We are having Christmas dinner and we have extra. I always wanted a dad, and maybe you are supposed to come today." He stared at her, unsure if he had heard her right. Her voice was so matter-of-fact, not the kind of thing a child would say to a stranger, but there was no fear in her, just sincerity and kindness. And before he could even find a response, another voice called out behind her. Mia. The girl turned around and waved. "It's okay, Mommy, he is nice." A woman approached, walking briskly across the snow. She was dressed in a long blue coat, her dark hair pulled back beneath a scarf, her face striking with sharp cheekbones and clear blue eyes. Her gaze went straight to Edward, not hostile but alert, as if ready to defend if necessary. Edward stood immediately. "Sorry," he said quickly, "she just came up to me. I didn't mean to startle anyone." The woman looked at him, then at Mia, who stood calmly between them, then back to him. Her expression softened slightly. "She does this sometimes," she said gently, walking up beside her daughter, then extending a hand. "Sophie, this is Mia." "Edward," he said, shaking her hand briefly. "Your daughter is brave, or maybe just unusually kind." Sophie looked at Mia and smiled, then said, "Would you like to join us? It's not much, but she's right, we have extra, and no one should be alone on Christmas." Something in her tone was firm, like she had made the decision not just out of pity but out of principle. Like this was simply what decent people did. Edward hesitated, not because he doubted her but because he was not sure. He remembered how to say yes to something without calculating the return, but tonight he was tired of calculations. He was tired of being alone. "Yes," he said simply, "thank you." And as he followed them across the snowy street, something in him shifted a little, like maybe this winter would not end the way it had begun. Cold, quiet and forgotten. The walk to their apartment was short, but felt strangely important, as if each step Edward took behind them pulled him a little farther away from the life he thought he belonged to. The little girl skipped ahead confidently, her red coat bright against the snow, while Sophie moved quietly beside her, graceful without trying to be. When they reached the front door of a modest brick building, Mia turned around and announced, "This is it," with pride, like she was revealing a hidden treasure. Sophie unlocked the door and they climbed a narrow staircase. The light overhead flickered slightly and the railing was worn smooth with time, but the space felt lived and not neglected. The second-floor hallway smelled faintly of pine and cookies and old radiators, and when Sophie opened the door to their apartment, warmth spilled out. Edward stepped inside slowly and took in the scene. It was a small space, 2 rooms and a kitchen. The floors were wooden, the furniture mismatched, but everything was clean and arranged with quiet care. The Christmas tree stood in one corner, slightly tilted, decorated with paper snowflakes, glittery stars, and a few old ornaments that looked like they had stories attached to them. A string of colorful lights blinked lazily over the windows, and a garland made of popcorn loops hung along the wall over the table. 2 stockings were pinned to the wall, one read Mia, the other Sophie. The dining table was already set with 3 plates and simple cloth napkins. A pitcher of water stood in the center beside a small dish of cranberry sauce. It smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon inside. Edward felt something stretch and settle, like he had walked into a memory he forgot he missed. Make yourself comfortable, Sophie said as she pulled off her coat. Mia was already out of her boots and dragging a chair over for him. You can sit here next to me, she declared. He smiled, took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door, then lowered himself into the chair. The heat from the nearby radiator soaked into his bones, and for the first time all day he stopped feeling cold. Mia climbed into her seat and kicked her legs beneath the table. Sophie returned a moment later with a tray of food. There was roasted turkey, mashed potatoes with flecks of herbs, buttered green beans, and warm rolls wrapped in a cloth napkin. No dish was extravagant, but every item looked homemade and cared for. When they began to eat, conversation flowed gently. Mia talked almost non-stop, asking him about dinosaurs and favorite colors, and if he liked snow. She told him she was in kindergarten and that she wanted to be a superhero nurse when she grew up, just like her mom. Sophie chuckled softly and said, well, I am a nurse, but I do not wear a cape. Mia wrinkled her nose. You should. Sophie looked at Edward and gave a small apologetic smile. I hope this is all right. It's more casual than what you are probably used to. Edward looked at her, then at Mia and at the table, and something in his chest softened. It's perfect, he said, and meant it. After dinner they sat with mugs of hot cocoa. Edward noticed how Mia leaned into him without hesitation, like she had known him longer than the hour they had shared. Sophie watched her daughter with a look that held more than words: tiredness, warmth, fierce love. She met Edward's eyes, and for a second he felt exposed, seen not as a man who owned companies or made decisions, but as someone who had forgotten how it felt to be part of something normal. Mia eventually fell asleep on the couch, her head against a pillow, her legs tucked under a blanket. Sophie stood and gently moved the mug from her hand, careful not to wake her. Edward stood too unsure if he should say more or thank her or just leave. Before she spoke softly, thank you for accepting the invitation. Most people would not have. Her tone was calm but sincere, and he realized something. She had not just been opening her door, she had been opening her world. Even just a crack. It had been a risk, he could feel it, and he had not expected it, but now he was here and he did not want to leave. Not yet, he said instead of goodbye. Sophie looked at him, not with a smile exactly, but with something real, like a small nod from one soul to another. When he finally stepped back into the cold, it did not feel quite as sharp as before, and when he looked back at the window and saw the faint outline of the tree glowing in the corner of their apartment, he realized he was already thinking about tomorrow. The next morning Edward woke earlier than usual, not to the buzz of his phone or the ping of an email, but to the strange and quiet urge to do something he could not define. He stared at the ceiling of the hotel room where he had checked in late the night before. Though calling it a hotel was generous, it was a roadside inn, barely warmed by the ancient heater under the window. Still, it had been enough for sleep, or at least for rest, if not peace. The snow had not stopped outside, and the sky beyond the curtains was a soft pale gray. He rose slowly, dressed without turning on the television, and left his phone untouched on the nightstand. The world could wait. He was not sure what time it was when he stepped into the street again, boots crunching softly over the snow, but the town was beginning to stir, smoke curling from chimneys, a few bundled up figures hurrying past with coffee cups and scarves pulled high. There was no decision, only motion. He walked through the sleepy town, following instinct and memory, until he found himself once again standing across the street from the apartment building. With the green door, the bakery nearby was open, the window fogged from heat inside, so he went and bought a small white box of pastries, not knowing which kind Mia liked, but remembering how her eyes lit up at the thought of dessert. Then, with the box tucked under one arm, he crossed the street, climbed the familiar steps, and knocked once on the door. It took a moment, but then he heard footsteps, and then the door opened just a few inches and Sophie stood there in a soft gray sweater and jeans, her hair loosely tied, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and something else warmer. She opened the door fully. I did not expect to see you, she said. Her voice was quiet but not unwelcome. I wasn't sure if I should come, he admitted, but then I wasn't sure I could stay away. She looked at the box in his hand, then stepped aside. Come in, please. He entered and again was greeted by that now familiar warmth. The air smelled of coffee and something faintly sweet, maybe toast or cinnamon. The tree still blinked in the corner, its lights dimmer in the morning sun but still stubbornly cheerful. Mia was sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by crayons and paper. She looked up and when she saw him her whole face lit up. She jumped up and ran over. Edward, you came back. He knelt down and handed her the box. I brought something for breakfast, pastry. She gasped the way only children can gasp. Like had just handed her treasure. She took the box and ran back to the table calling for her mom to come look. Sophie shook her head smiling as she followed her daughter. Edward stood awkwardly not knowing where to place himself until Sophie looked over her shoulder. Sit anywhere you like, and so he did. He sat and watched as Sophie carefully opened the box, divided the pastries in half and gave the largest to Mia. Mia offered him a bite without hesitation and he took it with exaggerated delight, earning a giggle. She told him about a movie she had watched the night before, how she wanted to build a snow castle and maybe teach her stuffed bear to sing. Sophie sipped her coffee and occasionally chimed in, but mostly she let them talk, watching with those quiet observant eyes. Edward noticed she watched more than she spoke, and when she did speak it was with a kind of deliberate thoughtfulness that made every word feel worth more. After breakfast Sophie cleared the plates and asked Mia to go wash up, which she did with a hop in her step. When they were alone Sophie turned to him and leaned against the kitchen counter. I still don't know who you are, she said simply, not accusing, just stating a truth. Edward met her gaze for a moment then said quietly, I'm someone who has everything and feels like he has nothing. Sophie looked at him longer, her eyes not blinking. That sounds familiar, she said softly. He nodded and then added, I can leave if I am intruding. I just didn't want to spend a day pretending yesterday did not happen. You're not intruding, she said. Not yet anyway. He almost laughed, but then Mia came back and plopped onto the couch holding a book and saying, Edward, will you read to me? Sophie raised a brow at him. Your choice. He crossed the room, sat beside Mia and opened the book. Her small shoulder leaned against him without hesitation, and as he began to read aloud he felt a knot in his chest loosen, not vanish but loosen. It was not the plot of the story that mattered but the fact that the words filled the room in a way that felt right, and somewhere in the middle of the third page he looked up and saw Sophie watching them, not with suspicion, not with doubt, but with something quiet and vulnerable, maybe even hope. And he knew in that moment he had not just returned out of curiosity, he had returned because he missed something he could not name, because he wanted to stay, because this strange unexpected detour had begun to feel like the beginning of something real, and that scared him in the best possible way. The days that followed blurred together in a way that felt quiet and significant. Edward found reasons to visit, reasons that grew less like excuses and more like truth. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes he helped fix something small in the apartment, a loose cabinet hinge, a flickering lamp, a stuck window. Once he showed up with a stack of picture books he had ordered after reading with Mia for the third time in a row and realizing she had memorized every line of the one she owned. Sophie never asked him to come, but she never asked him to leave either, and that became its own kind of invitation. He learned that she worked nights at the hospital and slept during the day when she could, that Mia went to kindergarten around the corner, and that sometimes they ate dinner in their pajamas because it made the day feel lighter. They had rituals, quiet ones, and Edward slowly became part of them, not as a guest but as a presence. Mia began to expect him. She would save him drawings on the table, leave one cookie aside just in case he comes, mommy, and if he was late she would peer out the window and ask when the snow fell heavier. Sophie invited him to stay for soup and he accepted without hesitation. It was on one of those evenings while Mia was in the bath splashing behind a cracked open door that Sophie looked at him with that calm direct expression of hers and said, do you ever miss your real life? He looked up from the tea she had poured him, surprised. I don't know what that means anymore, he said. After a moment she watched him, her blue eyes steady. You do not talk like a man who works in retail or lives nearby, she said, and I don't think you are just passing through. Edward nodded slowly, setting down his cup. And not passing through anymore. I do have another life, one with meetings and assistants and contracts and long words on expensive paper, but this life right here, this one is the first one that feels like something I might actually miss if I lost it. She did not look away and neither did he. She said softly, you don't have to tell me everything, not yet, just don't lie to us. He looked down at his hands then back up at her. I want. She nodded. Good, because I don't let people close easily and Mia gets attached faster than I can protect her. Edward heard the weight in those words, the layers of something old and tired and deeply honest. I understand, he said, and he did. Mia came running out a moment later wrapped in a towel and holding a foam crown. Look, I am the princess of bubbles, she shouted, leaping into Edward's arms before either adult could stop her. He caught her easily, laughed and said, then I must be your royal servant. Sophie leaned back against the counter, arms folded but a soft smile playing on her lips. She watched as Mia curled into him like she had known him forever, and Edward held her like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was later, after Mia was tucked into bed and the apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the heater, Sophie handed Edward a blanket as he stood by the door. You can stay on the couch tonight. If you don't want to go back out there it's late. He looked at her and nodded, grateful not just for the place to rest but for what the offer meant. Trust. It was something she offered carefully like everything else about her, and it was something he would not take for granted. He sat on the couch in the dim light of the tree, watched the soft shadows flicker on the walls, and realized that the silence in this place was not empty, it was peaceful. There was a difference, and for the first time in a long time Edward closed his eyes and fell asleep, not in a room full of marble and glass but in a home where the air smelled of cocoa and crayons, and the future no longer felt like something to fear but something that just might be worth hoping for. When Edward woke up the next morning he did not recognize the feeling at first. The couch was slightly too small, his back ached from the unfamiliar shape, and the light that filtered through the window was warm but indirect. It took him a moment to realize where he was, and when he did the tightness in his chest did not return. Instead there was a softness, like he had slipped into something that did not demand anything from him. He heard the quiet clatter of dishes in the kitchen and the low hum of a kettle on the stove. When he sat up and folded the blanket, Sophie glanced over from where she stood barefoot on the tile, pouring tea into two mismatched mugs. "Good morning," she said, her voice still low. "From sleep? I hope the couch did not ruin your spine." He smiled and stretched a little. "It's the most peaceful sleep I have had in years." Mia was already dressed in a sparkly shirt and leggings, dancing in small circles in front of the window while she held her stuffed bear in one hand and pretended it was talking. Edward watched her for a long moment, marveling at how easy it had become to be here, how natural the sound of her voice felt in the room, how Sophie now moved through space like she expected to see him there too. Sophie handed him a mug and leaned against the counter, watching Mia, her expression unreadable. She was always composed, but lately he had started to notice the cracks when she thought no one was looking, the way her shoulders dropped for just a moment when she exhaled, or how she sometimes blinked longer than necessary, like she was forcing herself to stay grounded. "Have you always been like this?" he asked suddenly. "Like what?" she replied, amused, open, strong. "I don't know," she said. "Simply maybe, or maybe I just did not have the luxury of falling apart. After Mia was born everything became about staying upright no matter what." It was not a complaint, it was a truth, one she had clearly lived through with grit and grace. "You're doing something right," Edward said softly. "She is a light." Sophie looked at him and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Then she said, "She likes you, you know." Edward smiled. "I like her too, more than I thought possible." They spent the rest of the morning cleaning up the living room, folding laundry and making pancakes. At Mia's insistence Edward tried flipping one and failed disastrously, causing Mia to howl with laughter and even Sophie to let out a rare full laugh, the kind that felt like it startled her too, like she had not heard herself sound like that in a long time. Later, when Mia settled on the floor with a coloring book, Sophie and Edward sat across from each other on the couch, their mugs refilled and their legs stretched out in opposite directions. She glanced sideways at him. "Do you miss it?" He looked up. "Your other life," she clarified, "the one with money and assistants and schedules and power." He considered the question for a long time. Finally he said, "I thought I would, but I think I miss the idea of it more than the thing itself. When you build your life around being useful to people who only care about results, you start to confuse that for love." And now he gestured toward the floor where Mia was humming to herself, and toward the small kitchen and the lopsided tree. "I come here and I feel seen in a way that has nothing to do with numbers or success." Sophie nodded. "I used to wonder if I was broken for not chasing more, but I think we are all just trying to survive in the shape that fits us. I like my little life. It is hard, but it is mine." Edward reached over without thinking and placed his hand on hers gently, not possessively, just contact. "Human. Thank you for letting me be part of it." She looked down at their hands, then back at him. "It scares me," she admitted, "not because of you but because we have done okay alone, and I do not know what it looks like to let someone in without expecting them to leave." He squeezed her hand once. "I do not want to leave." She held his gaze for a long time, then finally nodded. "Okay, not a promise, not a vow, just permission, a beginning." And that night, after Mia was asleep, after the house was dark and the snow started falling again outside the window, Edward sat on the couch again, only this time Sophie sat beside him. And when she leaned her head lightly on his shoulder and he did not move away, they both knew something unspoken had changed, and neither of them said anything because for once words were not necessary. It was enough to be there together, not alone, not afraid, just present, and that quiet warmth held more truth than anything he had ever signed his name to. January drifted in quietly like a hush over the world. The snow piled higher along sidewalks and windowsills, and the lights of Christmas slowly came down one by one, but inside the small apartment the warmth never quite left. Edward found himself returning nearly every evening, not because he had to or because of obligation, but because his day felt incomplete without it. He would arrive just after sunset, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing at all, just the unspoken understanding that he was welcome. Mia would greet him with unfiltered excitement as if he had been gone for days, not hours, and Sophie would smile, that small smile she always wore when she was trying not to show too much and failing just a little. Edward had started helping Mia with small projects. She had a cardboard box castle in progress and insisted he draw the dragons himself even though his artistic ability was deeply questionable. He read to her in the evenings and by now she had developed a habit of crawling into his lap with a blanket and book without asking. Sometimes she would fall asleep there, and he would carry her to her room and gently place her beneath her blanket, making sure her stuffed bear was in her arms. One night as he stepped quietly out of her room and into the dim living room, he found Sophie waiting by the window, her arms crossed loosely as she stared out into the snow. The light from the lamp behind her made a halo around her hair and for a moment she looked almost unreal. Edward joined her without speaking and stood beside her watching the snow fall. She broke the silence with a question, soft and careful. What happens when your world calls you back? He looked at her and understood the weight behind it. He thought of the emails he still had not answered, the board members growing impatient, the events he had declined without explanation. He thought of the office, the apartment, the view of the skyline that had once made him feel powerful and now made him feel nothing. And then he thought of this room, the smell of cocoa and pine, the faint hum of Mia's breathing behind the door, the steady presence of Sophie. And he said honestly, I do not want to go back to that version of myself. It was never real, not the way this is. She looked at him and there was both relief and fear in her expression, like she had been hoping for that answer and also terrified of trusting it. She said nothing, but after a moment she reached out and took his hand. He held hers gently and they stood that way for a long time watching the world soften beneath the snow. A few days later Mia was coloring at the kitchen table when she asked her question with complete seriousness and a mouth full of peanut butter, are you going to be my dad? Edward blinked, stunned by the simplicity and weight of it. Sophie froze mid-step, her eyes wide. Mia continued, I mean you are here all the time and you tuck me in and you always know how to make my toast not burn. So are you? Edward knelt down beside her and looked her in the eyes. I would be honored to be your dad if you want that and if your mom is okay with it. Mia grinned and launched forward, throwing her arms around his neck, then shouted, Mom. He said yes. Sophie laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from deep relief and something close to joy. Later that night Edward and Sophie sat on the couch as they often did, the tree now bare but still standing and the room as quiet as falling snow. He turned to her and said, I meant it, I want to stay, I want to be here, not just visiting, not waiting for the next goodbye. I want to build something real with both of you. Sophie looked at him and for once there was no guarded distance, no cautious line she had drawn. Her face was open, full of light and disbelief and something like love. Then stay, she said, and he did not move away. He did not hesitate because this time there was nothing left to run from and everything to run toward, this quiet life, this imperfect beautiful home, this love that had found him not in a tower but in a tiny apartment with paper snowflakes and a 5-year-old who asked honest questions and gave honest answers. Edward had built empires, made fortunes, led thousands, but this moment, this family, this yes was the only thing that ever felt like his for real, and he would not let it go. First time Edward took Sophie and Mia out together, it was to a small art museum just outside of town. The idea had come from Mia, who had declared with complete authority that grown-ups needed more colors in their lives, and Sophie, who had not had a full day off in weeks, reluctantly agreed. When Saturday arrived, Edward picked them up in the morning wearing his usual tailored coat but with something different in his face, a lightness that had begun to live there full time. Mia was already bouncing with excitement in the back seat, holding her sketchbook and a pack of colored pencils. She insisted on bringing. Sophie sat in the front seat, her hand resting casually on her lap, but her eyes kept drifting toward Edward when she thought he would not notice. The museum was quiet and warm, with large windows and soft lighting and rooms filled with abstract paintings and strange sculptures. Mia took it all in with wonder and curiosity, asking endless questions and sometimes answering them herself. Edward watched her with the kind of smile that came from deep joy, not performance, and when she grabbed his hand to pull him toward a sculpture shaped like a giant teacup, he followed without hesitation. Sophie walked behind them. At moments like that she could see it clearly how seamlessly he had become part of their rhythm, not by forcing his way in but by showing up again and again like clockwork, but softer. After a few hours they went to the museum cafe and sat at a corner table sipping cocoa and eating sandwiches. Mia told the server that Edward was her maybe dad and Sophie almost choked on her drink, but the server just laughed and said that sounded like a very good title. Edward winked at Mia and said it sounded good to him too. After lunch they visited the gift shop where Mia insisted on buying a postcard with a print of a blue horse for Edward because she said it looked like strength, and he took it like it was gold. When they left the museum the snow had started again, light and glittering in the late afternoon sun. Instead of going straight home they walked through the small town center, the streets lined with shops and twinkling lights. Mia found a pile of snow and made a tiny snowman while Edward helped her shape the head. Sophie stood nearby, watching them, her hands deep in her Coat pockets, her breath curling in the air. She felt something inside her shift slowly, like a door she had kept locked was opening just a crack. Later, back at the apartment, Edward helped Mia put the new postcard on the fridge with a magnet, and they all had pasta for dinner. Sophie made it from scratch, and Edward grated the cheese too much on purpose so Mia would have something to tease him about after dinner. They all sat on the couch under one blanket, Mia in the middle, her head resting on Edward's shoulder as they watched an animated movie she had seen a dozen times but still gasped at all the dramatic parts. When she fell asleep curled between them, Edward carried her to bed, gently tucking her in and placing her bare beside her. He lingered at the doorway for a moment, then turned off the light and stepped back into the living room. Sophie was sitting quietly on the couch, staring at the window where the snow had begun to stick to the glass. Edward sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence was not heavy, just full. He turned to her and said softly, "You and Mia have given me more than I ever knew I needed. I did not think I could belong anywhere until now." She looked at him and her eyes were filled with something fierce and afraid and hopeful all at once. She whispered, "I am scared to believe this could last because everything else has not." He reached out, took her hand and said, "Then let me prove it." Over and over she leaned against him, and they sat that way for a long time, the snow falling, the world still and quiet and safe. And when she finally said, "I think I love you," he did not answer with words, just held her tighter, and that was enough, because some things do not need grand declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes love just comes home quietly, kicks off its shoes, helps make dinner and tucks a small child into bed. And in that ordinary night Edward realized that what he had built with Sophie and Mia was more than a new chapter. It was the story he had always wanted to be part of, even if he had never known how to ask for it. The snow had returned heavier now, blanketing the town in deep layers of quiet and light. The streets were slower, the lights warmer, and the days passed with a kind of rhythm that felt permanent, like winter had settled not only into the sky but into the heart of something new inside the little apartment. Life moved differently. Edward no longer knocked, he no longer waited outside. He had a key now given to him by Sophie one quiet morning without ceremony, just a small piece of metal placed in his palm with a look that said more than words could hold. He came and went between meetings, between calls, but now the suits were gone, traded for sweaters. The phone stayed silent most days and the laptop only opened after bedtime. He had shifted not because he had to but because he wanted to. There was no dramatic announcement, no press release, only a man who realized the greatest return he had ever seen was a quiet life filled with love and routine and small moments of joy. Mia had begun calling him Dad, not every time. Sometimes it was Edward, sometimes it was just hey, but more often than not it was Daddy, and each time it cracked something open inside him that he had spent years locking away. The title came without permission but with full trust, and he wore it like armor and also like a gift Sophie had let him in fully. She no longer held her breath around him, no longer measured her steps. He knew the way she liked her tea, the way she hummed when she folded laundry, the exact shape of her smile when Mia said something clever. He had memorized the lines of this life not out of obligation but out of awe. And one night in early February he sat at the table while Mia colored beside him and Sophie stood by the stove stirring soup, and he looked at them, the woman he loved, the child who had found him on a bench when he had nothing left to offer. And he reached into his pocket and took out a small velvet box. He did not get down on one knee, he did not plan a speech, he simply opened it and placed it gently on the table beside Mia's crayons and said softly, "This is not a question about obligation or duty or even about tradition. This is me asking to stay forever if you will have me." Sophie turned slowly, her eyes landing on the box, then on him. She did not cry, not right away. She walked over, sat across from him, looked at the ring and then at Mia, who had not said anything yet. Then Mia said, "Are you going to be my real dad for always?" And Edward said, "Yes, if you both say I can be." Sophie looked at him and her voice when it came was steady and clear and full of something that had taken a long time to trust. She said, "We already chose you." Then she smiled and nodded, and Mia squealed and said, "Now we are a real family." And Edward, who had once signed deals worth billions, realized this was the only yes he had ever needed. They did not rush a wedding. There were no headlines, no designer suits, just three people learning how to belong to each other more deeply every day. And a few months later, on a soft spring morning, they stood together in a park under a tree just budding with green and said the words that made what they had already known official. And afterwards Mia threw petals into the air and danced in circles while Sophie laughed, and Edward watched them with a heart that finally felt full. And it all began with a question from a little girl on Christmas Eve: "Are you alone?" And the answer, "Now forever," was no, never again. The ending of The Christmas That Changed Everything is quiet on purpose. Not dramatic, not explosive, because real love doesn't always need fireworks. Sometimes, it arrives as a whisper. As a child's question. As an unexpected knock on a door you didn't know your heart had left open. For me, this story was never just about a lonely millionaire or a struggling single mom. It was about what happens when two lives that have learned how to survive separately, finally choose to live together. It's about earned belonging, not instant connection. About how love takes time, space, and small, repeated acts of showing up. I love that Edward didn't rescue Olivia and Mia, but instead, they rescued each other in different ways. He brought steadiness. They gave him meaning. And in the end, it wasn't a grand gesture that made them a family. It was presence. And presence is more powerful than perfection. The story ends not with a wedding or a mansion or a headline. It ends with three people walking through the snow, hand in hand, side by side. And to me, that's everything.